Have you ever wondered how a single overlooked artwork could change the way we understand one of history's greatest geniuses? Imagine standing in an auction room, surrounded by hundreds of people, when suddenly your eyes lock on a portrait that feels strangely out of place, as if it doesn't quite belong to the time period described. Has this ever happened to you? That sense that what you're looking at carries secrets much deeper than anyone around you can see? That is exactly what happened in 1998, when a modest drawing of a young woman in profile, executed in chalk on vellum, quietly appeared at auction. It was catalogued as nothing more than the work of an anonymous 19th-century German artist, supposedly imitating the Italian Renaissance style. No fanfare, no extraordinary attention, just another piece moving through the hands of the art world. And yet, this seemingly ordinary moment was about to ignite one of the most fascinating debates in modern art history. But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. Now picture the scene. The auctioneer raises his voice. The bidders shuffle nervously. And among them sits Peter Silverman, a passionate collector with an eye for beauty and a mind attuned to detail. The drawing, so delicate yet so commanding, immediately captures his attention. Something about the portrait doesn't feel like the clumsy attempt of a later imitator. Instead, it resonates with a refinement and subtlety that whispers of the Renaissance itself. What you're about to discover might surprise you, because Silverman's intuition would eventually lead him down a path no one expected. A path that touched the very legacy of Leonardo da Vinci. As the auction unfolded, Silverman placed his bid, raising the stakes to $18,000, twice the minimum required. For him, the value was not in the estimate printed in the catalog, but in the possibility that this forgotten work might hold a much greater story. Yet fate can be cruel. Another bidder, perhaps sensing the same spark, raised the offer to $21,000 and took the piece away. At that moment, Silverman must have felt the bitter taste of defeat. It seemed certain he would never see that mysterious drawing again. Stay with me until the end, because what happened next proves that destiny has a way of circling back. 9 long years passed. The world moved on, yet Silverman never completely forgot the profile of that young woman. Then, in a twist worthy of a novel, he stumbled upon a gallery in Manhattan, and there it was, the very same drawing he had lost in the auction room years before. The recognition must have been electric, as though a ghost from the past had reappeared to give him a second chance. Without hesitation, he inquired about the price, quietly negotiated, and walked out of the gallery with the piece carefully tucked in, and envelope under his arm. He couldn't have known it then, but he was carrying what some would later call a lost Leonardo. Has this ever happened to you? That instant when a forgotten opportunity suddenly re-emerges, offering you a chance to rewrite the story? That is the energy that surrounded Silverman as he left the gallery, unaware that the portrait of this mysterious woman would one day ignite fierce debates among scholars, historians, and scientists across the world. Could this modest drawing, dismissed at auction as the work of an imitator, actually be the hand of Leonardo da Vinci himself? The questions raised here are only the beginning, because as we dig deeper into the story, we will uncover clues hidden within the strokes, the materials, and the very shadows of this portrait. And with each revelation, the possibility grows that this artwork was far more than anyone ever imagined. Stay with me, because the next chapter in this investigation will take us into the heart of the mystery, where science, history, and art collide in ways that continue to challenge everything we thought we knew. If you enjoy uncovering hidden stories and seeing history from a new perspective, make sure to subscribe. That way, you'll always be part of these discoveries, and together we can keep exploring the mysteries that continue to inspire and transform the way we see the world. Imagine the weight of that moment. 9 years of silence after losing something that had stirred your intuition, and suddenly, there it is again, quietly waiting for you as if destiny had carefully hidden it behind the scenes of time. Peter Silverman could have walked past the gallery, dismissed the faint memory, or even ignored the familiar glance of the young woman in profile. But something deep inside him, Perhaps that same mindset that distinguishes seekers from mere spectators told him to pause. It wasn't just a drawing anymore, it was a second chance, a revelation that would transform the course of his journey. When he walked out of the gallery with the piece tucked under his arm, it was not wrapped in the glory of a masterpiece or the applause of recognition. It was simple, fragile, carried in nothing more than an envelope. Yet within those delicate lines of chalk on vellum, there rested the possibility of a hidden truth. How many times in our own lives do we carry something that seems ordinary on the surface, while its real impact waits silently, preparing to unfold? Silverman had no way of knowing that what he held was more than art. It was a puzzle capable of dividing scholars, igniting debates, and rewriting narratives. The irony is striking. At the auction, this drawing had been treated as an imitation, a mere echo of greatness. But what if that judgment had been wrong? What if the world had overlooked not just an object, but a message from the past, preserved through centuries, waiting for someone willing to see differently? This is the kind of decision that reshapes a story. Where others saw a forgotten artifact, Silverman perceived transformation, the possibility that genius can hide in plain sight until the right eyes fall upon it. There is a powerful lesson here about perspective. In life, much like in art, the surface rarely reveals everything. Behind what seems ordinary may lie the extraordinary, and it often takes courage to believe in that possibility. Silverman's rediscovery wasn't just about buying back a piece of paper, it was about embracing the uncertainty, the uncharted territory of doubt, and following an instinct stronger than logic. The impact of that moment echoes far beyond the art world. It speaks to every decision we make when we choose to trust intuition over appearances. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the story doesn't stop with a collector and a chance encounter in Manhattan. Once the drawing entered Silverman's hands, its quiet presence began to stir powerful currents in the world of art. And beyond, it carried with it a promise of revelations, the possibility of rewriting history, and the tension between skepticism and belief. And this is where the real transformation begins, not only in how experts view the portrait, but in how we understand the fragile line between certainty and doubt. Before we move forward, take a moment and write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." Because when you do, you're acknowledging that sometimes the most important discoveries happen not in grand stages, but in the subtle details life places in front of us, waiting for us to notice. What makes a mystery truly irresistible is not just what is seen, but what refuses to be explained at first glance. When Silverman began looking closer at the portrait, doubts immediately surfaced. The young woman's face, perfectly profiled against the vellum, stood out in a way that contradicted the patterns of Leonardo's known works. This detail was enough to ignite skepticism, because Leonardo was known for his subtle angles, the half-turns, the delicate positioning of figures that gave them a sense of movement and life. To find a portrait strictly in profile was unusual, almost out of character, and this alone created friction between intuition and academic certainty. Yet sometimes it is precisely in what breaks the pattern that the hidden truth begins to reveal itself. The medium added another layer of intrigue. Vellum, that delicate material prepared from animal skin, had been used by countless artists and scribes across centuries. To most, it seemed like an ordinary choice, but to those who knew Leonardo's restless habits, it was a clue worth chasing. He often experimented, sketching in notebooks, testing lines and techniques before creating his grand works. The idea that this drawing could have been one of those behind-the-scenes experiments, a fragment of a larger vision, reshaped Silverman's mindset. It pushed him to see not just a piece of chalk on vellum, but a window into a process, a journey of creation frozen in time. Still, another obstacle remained: the absence of a signature. In today's world, where authorship and identity are guarded with logos and marks, it seems almost unthinkable that masterpieces could exist without a name attached. But during the Renaissance, this was not uncommon. Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, giants of art whose names echo through history, rarely signed their works. Their value was not in the mark of ownership, but in the silent authority of the art itself. This reality made attributions a complex puzzle, where decisions rested not on a name at the bottom of the page, but on patterns of light, shading, and detail. Think for a moment about the impact of that. How many times in life do we seek certainty in labels, only to find that the real meaning hides in the essence rather than the surface? This portrait challenged the comfortable assumptions of experts and collectors alike. Its lack of signature became both a limitation and a revelation, a reminder that some truths are not declared openly but must be uncovered through persistence and vision. Silverman stood at the edge of something larger than he realized. Each contradiction, each irregularity, was not just an obstacle, but an invitation to dive deeper. The profile view, the vellum, the absence of a name, together they formed a map of questions that hinted at a story still waiting to be told. It was a test of perspective, a demand for patience, and, above all, a spark that turned curiosity into obsession. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because what followed was not only an investigation into pigment and paper, but a confrontation with belief itself. Silverman's journey was about to collide with the authority of experts, the rigor of science, and the weight of history. And it is precisely within that collision that the most powerful revelations began to emerge. Before we continue, I want to invite you to write in the comments, "I see beyond the surface," because this phrase captures the essence of the story, recognizing that what first appears doubtful or ordinary might hold a hidden brilliance waiting to be revealed. When the first experts cast their eyes on the mysterious portrait, their verdict was almost immediate. It could not have been created during the Renaissance. The lines, the composition, even the unusual medium seemed to disqualify it in their minds. For many, that dismissal would have been the end of the story, a final word spoken with authority. But Peter Silverman carried a different mindset. Instead of accepting the judgment, he chose to pursue a deeper analysis, convinced that what others rejected might still hold a hidden truth. It was not stubbornness. It was a decision born out of intuition, the kind that pushes someone to look beyond appearances and into the subtle details others overlook. That decision brought him to Mina Gregori, one of the most respected art historians of her time. As she studied the portrait, her observations broke open a new possibility. She noticed the delicate beauty of the features, a trait she associated with the Florentine school, but also the intricate hairstyle and clothing, which reflected the Milanese tradition. This combination of influences was not random. It was the exact kind of artistic synthesis that Leonardo da Vinci embodied. Unlike most painters of his era, who often remained anchored in one city or style, Leonardo's journey took him across different courts and cultural centers, absorbing techniques and transforming them into something uniquely his own. Think of what that means. The portrait carried the fingerprints of two distinct worlds, Florence and Milan, united in one face. Behind the scenes of history, Leonardo had been shaped by both. In Florence, he refined his precision in works like The Baptism of Christ and The Annunciation, where every detail of light and proportion revealed the influence of classical ideals. In Milan, his art transformed into something grander, more theatrical, with pieces like The Last Supper and The Virgin of the Rocks, reflecting a courtly sophistication. To see both of these worlds echoing in a single drawing was more than coincidence. It was a revelation. For Silverman, this was more than confirmation. It was impact. Each observation brought him closer to the possibility that the artwork he held was not an imitation, but part of Leonardo's true journey as an artist. And in that recognition lies a fascinating lesson. The most powerful discoveries often come when patterns collide, when contradictions stop being signs of error and begin to reveal transformation. What had first been seen as inconsistent, the unusual profile, the use of vellum, the lack of signature, was now reframed as a sign of genius at work, testing boundaries and refusing to fit neatly into expectations. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because Silverman's pursuit of answers was about to bring him into contact with another authority, one who saw not just the stylistic hints, but the physical traces of Leonardo's own hand. The investigation was no longer only about aesthetics. It was becoming a dialogue between history, science, and the intuition of a collector who refused to let go of a mystery. And here's something I'd love for you to do. Write in the comments, "I trust my intuition." Because in many ways, this story is also about the decisions we make when evidence and instinct collide, and how sometimes it takes courage to believe in what others cannot yet see. When Nicholas Turner, an experienced curator from the British Museum, laid his eyes on the drawing, something remarkable caught his attention. The fine lines that shaped the shadows, the delicate hatching on the contours of the face, leaned in a very particular direction. To most observers it was a detail too subtle to notice, but Turner recognized it instantly. The marks moved in the rhythm of a left hand. Leonardo da Vinci was famously left-handed, and this was not just a trivial fact about his life. It was a signature embedded within his technique. Where right-handed artists would shade from one angle, Leonardo's strokes naturally flowed the other way. In that simple technical observation, the possibility that this portrait belonged to him gained a powerful new foundation. And then there was the matter of light. Leonardo was obsessed with illumination, not merely as a physical reality but as a philosophy of art. His notebooks are filled with reflections on how light falls, how shadows breathe, how perspective transforms what the eye perceives. Turner saw that the shading of this profile was not random. It followed the very theories Leonardo himself had developed. The transition from shadow to light, the balance between depth and delicacy, carried the precision of someone who did not simply copy reality, but who dissected it in order to reveal a deeper truth. This was not imitation. It was revelation through technique. Yet, as with every story that touches greatness, opposition rose quickly. Carmen Bambach, a highly respected curator from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, dismissed the attribution. To her, the work could not belong to Leonardo because, as far as records showed, he had never used vellum for portraiture. Her stance was clear, rooted in the catalogue of known works, where vellum was absent in paintings of figures. For many, this was a decisive argument. After all, how could one of the most studied artists in history suddenly break the rules of his own known practice? But history is not always confined to what has been catalogued. Behind the scenes, Leonardo's notebooks told a different story. He had experimented on vellum before, creating illustrations for mathematical texts, drafting geometric figures, and testing ideas. To say he never used the material for a portrait was to assume limits that may never have existed in his restless mind. Leonardo was a man of transformation, constantly shifting between mediums, searching for new ways to capture both science and beauty. Why would a piece of vellum stop him? This clash of perspectives reveals something fascinating. Truth is rarely straightforward. It is shaped by decisions, interpretations, and the courage to question. Silverman found himself in the middle of a battlefield between certainty and doubt, intuition and evidence, tradition and innovation. The impact of this debate was no longer about one small drawing. It was about the very way we construct history, and how much room we allow for what doesn't fit neatly into established narratives. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because what followed was not just argument, but investigation, where science would step in to measure time itself, pushing the search for answers beyond opinions and into the realm of proof. And before we move forward, leave a comment with the phrase, "Details reveal the truth," because this phrase captures the essence of why something so small, like the angle of a stroke or the choice of a material, can completely transform the story we believe to be certain. The objections that claimed Leonardo had never touched vellum for portraits began to lose strength once his own notebooks were revisited. There, among sketches of machines and anatomical studies, were the precise illustrations he created for Luca Pacioli's De Divina Proporzione. These drawings, made on vellum, were not merely diagrams. They carried the same obsessive care for proportion, harmony, and geometry that defined his art. It was undeniable proof that Leonardo was comfortable working on this delicate surface. The material, once considered a decisive argument against authenticity, suddenly shifted into the opposite direction, opening the door to a hidden truth that had been overlooked. For Silverman, this revelation sparked a transformation in the way he saw the portrait. If Leonardo had already used vellum for scientific illustrations, why not for a figure study? the possibility emerged that this profile of a young woman might have been created not as a standalone artwork, but as part of a manuscript, an illustration destined to live within the pages of a book. That thought changed everything. Because once you imagine the portrait not as an isolated piece, but as a fragment of a larger journey, it becomes part of a story that stretches across centuries, connecting the intimate craft of a genius to the ceremonial objects of his time. Still, speculation needed more than intuition, and that is when science entered the stage. Silverman decided to subject the drawing to carbon-14 testing, a method capable of determining the age of organic material by measuring the slow, invisible decay of carbon atoms. It was a decision that required patience, but one that would add weight to an argument that had so far lived in the space between belief and disbelief. The results came back with precision. The vellum had been produced between 1440 and 1650. In a single stroke, the 19th-century attribution made at the original auction was shattered. The impact of that revelation was enormous. The timeline aligned perfectly with Leonardo's life, preserving the possibility that his hand had touched that surface. But as is often the case with discoveries that challenge established narratives, new doubts immediately arose. Couldn't a skilled forger have used ancient vellum to create a modern counterfeit? Could someone have planted the illusion of authenticity by exploiting the very material that gave the portrait its credibility? The hidden truth was still cloaked in layers of uncertainty. And yet, even this shadow of doubt carried its own meaning. It reminded everyone involved that the journey toward certainty is never linear. Just as Leonardo himself was a man of constant transformation, moving between disciplines and reinventing ideas, the search for answers about this portrait became a reflection of that same restless spirit. Every new test, every contradiction, was not the end of the story, but part of a process that forced people to look deeper, to question assumptions, and to embrace the complexity of discovery. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the next stage of the investigation would no longer rely only on materials and dates, but on technology capable of magnifying reality itself, revealing details invisible to the naked eye, and opening new paths in the pursuit of authenticity. Before we move forward, take a moment and write in the comments, "Truth leaves traces." Because those words capture the essence of this journey, proof is often hidden in places so small that only patience, courage, and attention can bring it to light. The results of the carbon dating had given Silverman confidence, but they also opened the door to new waves of skepticism. After all, if the vellum was indeed from the right period, couldn't a clever forger have exploited that fact, using ancient material as a canvas for a modern deception? The possibility lingered like a shadow, casting doubt over every revelation. In the art world, hidden truths often come wrapped in layers of suspicion, and the line between authenticity and forgery is as fragile as the vellum itself. But Silverman wasn't ready to let uncertainty dictate the story. Instead, he sought a transformation in the investigation, one that would rely not on guesswork or tradition, but on the precision of science. That's when he turned to Lumiere Technology, a company specialized in advanced digital imaging. Their tools could peer beneath the surface, capturing the drawing in ultra-high resolution, at a level invisible to the human eye. Imagine being able to magnify each fiber, each stroke, until the journey of the artist's hand became a landscape of detail. What they uncovered was astonishing. Hidden behind the soft expression of the young woman were structural elements that aligned perfectly with Leonardo's known methods. It was as if the portrait carried within it the same rhythm and discipline found in works universally accepted as his. The scans revealed spirals, knots, and patterns in the hair that mirrored those in Lady with an Ermine. The proportions of the head and neck, so carefully measured, echoed the balance of other Renaissance portraits tied to Leonardo. Even the subtle details in the eyes, the curvature of the lashes, the way the shadows hugged the skin, bore an uncanny resemblance to sketches already attributed to him. These were not random coincidences. They were decisions born from the same mind, guided by the same obsession with harmony and depth. What makes this so powerful is the mindset it demands from us. When faced with doubts, most people stop at the first obstacle, accepting the safer path of dismissal. But here, technology created space for revelation, pushing past appearances to uncover something profound. It was a reminder that transformation often requires tools that shift perspective, allowing us to see what had always been there, but hidden. The drawing, once dismissed as the imitation of a 19th-century hand, now stood in dialogue with masterpieces recognized around the world. And the impact of that was undeniable. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because these revelations from digital analysis would soon attract even more experts, people whose life's work was to study Leonardo's genius. Their voices, filled with conviction or resistance, would shape the journey of this portrait in ways no machine could, and with each new layer of debate, the mystery only grew more compelling. Before we continue, I'd love to hear from you. Write in the comments, "Details never lie," because those words reflect the heart of this investigation, the belief that every line, every proportion, carries a story waiting to be uncovered if we dare to look closely enough. One of the most fascinating aspects of this mysterious portrait lies in the way shadows breathe life into it. Leonardo da Vinci once described shading as the very soul of drawing, and when experts examined the portrait under magnification, they noticed just how meticulously the transitions between light and dark had been constructed. The shadows were not crude or decorative. They were alive, unfolding across the contours of the face, as if guiding the viewer into the psychology of the figure. Each gradation revealed a hidden truth, echoing Leonardo's own mindset, that art was not merely a reflection of reality, but an exploration of how light transforms our perception of it. Then came another revelation. Christina Geddo, a respected scholar of Leonardo's work, identified something striking: the use of 3 different colors of dry pastel within the drawing. This technique, innovative and bold, was not common practice at the time. In fact, it was something Leonardo himself had pioneered, experimenting with layers and textures to achieve subtle effects that others had not dared to attempt. To see this approach embedded within the portrait was like peering behind the scenes of his creative journey, watching him test boundaries and invent techniques that would later define the Renaissance. The impact of such a discovery went beyond simple attribution. It was a window into Leonardo's restless genius, his willingness to experiment, and his refusal to conform to the predictable patterns of his contemporaries. But perhaps the most transformative moment arrived when Martin Kemp, one of the world's leading authorities on Leonardo da Vinci, was invited to study the drawing. Kemp had dedicated decades of his life to understanding Leonardo, dissecting every line, every fragment of his notebooks, every whisper of his artistry across centuries. He was a man not easily convinced, accustomed to rejecting countless claims of lost Leonardos brought before him. And yet, when he analyzed the portrait, something shifted. The balance of proportion, the language of the shadows, the harmony of line and form, all resonated with Leonardo's unmistakable touch. Kemp confessed that after 40 years of study, he thought he had seen everything, but this portrait challenged that certainty. For him, it was not just another artwork, it was a revelation, a rediscovery that carried the weight of history in its lines. There's something profoundly human in this part of the story. It speaks to how even the most experienced minds can encounter transformation when confronted with evidence that resonates deeply. It's a reminder that knowledge, no matter how vast, is never complete, and that the hidden truths of the past still have the power to unsettle and inspire us. The portrait was no longer just a drawing. It had become a catalyst for dialogue, for decisions that would ripple across the art world, forcing experts to question what they thought they knew, and to face the possibility that history had concealed one of Leonardo's masterpieces in plain sight. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because just as the conviction of experts seemed to solidify the case, new clues began to emerge from the very surface of the work itself, traces left not in shadows or proportions, but in something even more intimate, capable of bridging centuries with the touch of a single finger. And before we move forward, I'd love for you to write in the comments, "Shadows hold secrets," because those words capture the essence of Leonardo's vision, that in the interplay between light and darkness, the deepest revelations are waiting to be found. The conviction of Martin Kemp and the authority of other scholars gave the portrait a new identity. What had once been dismissed as the work of an imitator now carried a name, a story, and a title: La Bella Principessa. With the publication of their findings, the drawing stepped out of obscurity and into the spotlight as a potential lost masterpiece of Leonardo da Vinci. The announcement reverberated like a revelation across the art world, sparking debates, admiration, and resistance in equal measure. For some, it was a moment of transformation, the rediscovery of a treasure thought to have vanished into history. For others, it was a provocation, a challenge to their mindset and to the carefully established boundaries of what was known about Leonardo's body of work. Yet just as the portrait seemed to be gaining legitimacy, something unexpected emerged: an intimate trace hidden within the fibers of the vellum. During close analysis, experts uncovered what appeared to be a fingerprint. It was as if the very hand of the artist had reached across centuries, leaving behind a silent but personal signature. The impact of this discovery was electrifying. If authenticated, it could become the most decisive piece of evidence, a direct link between the portrait and Leonardo himself. The art world, so often divided by interpretation and theory, seemed for a moment united by anticipation. Could this be the ultimate proof that would silence doubts? But reality rarely offers such clean resolutions. Efforts to match the fingerprint with existing records proved inconclusive. Some specialists argued that the impressions were too partial, too fragmented to serve as reliable evidence. Others claimed that patterns could be compared to Leonardo's surviving works, but the clarity was not strong enough to declare certainty. To resolve the deadlock, the investigators did something bold. They reached out beyond the walls of academia, inviting experts worldwide to examine the print, hoping that fresh eyes might uncover what had been missed. Dozens of analysts responded, bringing their methods, their reputations, and their hopes to the task. Yet even with this collective effort, the result remained shrouded in ambiguity. The fingerprint became both a symbol of promise and of frustration, a hidden truth that refused to fully reveal itself. Instead of providing closure, it opened another chapter of doubt, reminding everyone that history often resists final answers. There is a powerful lesson in this tension. Sometimes the most compelling discoveries are not those that solve mysteries neatly, but those that force us to live within the uncertainty, to balance faith and skepticism, to question the very way we define truth. The fingerprint, whether genuine or not, changed the narrative. It shifted the conversation from attribution alone to the intimate, human connection of touch, the idea that genius can leave marks not just in ideas and brushstrokes, but in the physical traces of existence. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because what followed would bring an even more controversial figure into the journey, someone whose methods blurred the line between revelation and doubt, and whose decisions would ignite debates that shook the credibility of the entire investigation. And before we move forward, I'd love for you to write in the comments, "Truth leaves marks," because those words capture the essence of this moment, the belief that even the faintest trace can carry stories powerful enough to transform how we see the past. It was at this delicate stage of the investigation that Peter Paul Biro entered the scene. Known as a forensic expert in the art world, he specialized in finding fingerprints and other traces left behind by great masters, often stepping into controversies where traditional scholarship had stalled. When he examined the portrait, Biro made a claim that electrified both supporters and skeptics. He had found points of similarity between the fingerprint on La Bella Principessa and one attributed to Leonardo da Vinci in Saint Jerome in the wilderness. To many, it sounded like the missing piece, a revelation that could finally seal the attribution and silence the doubters. A hidden truth, left not in theory or style, but in the human imprint of Leonardo himself. But the story was never so simple. Biro's method was not like the standard forensic procedures used in criminal investigations. Instead, he employed techniques he had largely developed on his own, creating enhanced images and comparisons that he guarded closely. The lack of transparency became a source of unease. Critics began to argue that his conclusions were built on fragile ground, and that his insistence on secrecy undermined the credibility of his work. What was presented as science looked to some more like interpretation, dressed in the language of certainty. The mindset that had momentarily shifted toward belief was once again pulled back into doubt. And yet, controversy has its own kind of impact. When Biro's claim was announced, the story exploded in the media. Headlines around the world declared the rediscovery of a lost Leonardo. The art world, the press, and the public were swept up in the drama, captivated by the possibility that this drawing, purchased for a modest sum, was now worth a staggering $150 million. Behind the scenes, however, experts continued to debate. Some saw the fingerprint connection as a transformative discovery, a physical bridge across centuries. Others viewed it as a dangerous distraction, proof that desire for certainty can sometimes blind us to the fragility of evidence. There's something deeply human about this moment, the tension between the hunger for revelation and the caution of skepticism. It shows how decisions are rarely made in the calm of pure reason, but in the storm where hope, ambition, and doubt collide. Silverman's journey had now crossed into territory where the value of the portrait was no longer measured only by strokes of chalk or layers of pastel, but by the narratives people chose to believe. And those narratives carried enormous consequences, not only for the art market but for the legacy of Leonardo himself. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because just as the world was celebrating this supposed proof, new voices emerged to challenge it. Investigations began to turn their attention not only to the portrait, but to the credibility of the methods and the man who had presented them, shifting the spotlight from discovery to scrutiny. And before we continue, write in the comments, "I question the evidence," because this phrase captures the very essence of the story, recognizing that every revelation must be tested, and that true understanding is born in the space where belief and doubt wrestle for dominance. The momentum that had built around the fingerprint seemed unstoppable, until a journalist named David Gran pulled back the curtain. With meticulous research, he began dissecting Biro's methods, pointing out inconsistencies, and raising uncomfortable questions. What had been presented as objective proof now looked more like a fragile construction, vulnerable to scrutiny. Gran's critique did not simply undermine Biro, it shifted the conversation entirely. Suddenly, the debate was no longer just about the portrait, but about the credibility of those entrusted with discovering the hidden truth. This was a turning point in the journey, a reminder of how fragile trust can be when revelations depend on methods that cannot stand up to questioning. Yet even as doubts swirled, the drawing itself refused to fade into silence. New clues emerged directly from its physical surface, as if the portrait carried its own secret testimony. Along one edge, investigators noticed tiny knife marks and 3 small holes, neatly aligned, as though the vellum had once been stitched into the binding of a book. These were not random damages or the wear of time. They were purposeful, deliberate, a sign that the portrait had lived another life before it ever hung on a wall. This detail transformed the investigation, reframing the drawing not as a solitary piece of art, but as part of a larger narrative, one hidden behind the scenes of Renaissance history. That is when attention turned toward a remarkable discovery in Poland's National Library. There rested a manuscript, richly illustrated on vellum, dedicated to the Sforza family, the powerful dynasty that had ruled Milan and employed Leonardo himself. Among its pages, scholars found a conspicuous absence, a missing leaf, carefully removed, leaving behind the telltale marks of its extraction. When compared with the drawings Silverman now possessed, the alignment of holes was precise, almost as if the portrait had been torn from that very book, centuries earlier. The impact of this connection was profound. If true, it placed the portrait directly within the orbit of Leonardo's patrons, the same family for whom he created some of his most celebrated works. It was more than stylistic analysis, more than forensic claims. It was a historical thread, a link between the art and the context that had birthed it. The possibility that the drawing might once have been commissioned to honor Bianca Sforza, a young noblewoman of Milan, gave the portrait a new weight. It was no longer just about technical evidence or fingerprints, but about a human story, a face tied to power, lineage, and memory. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because this revelation about the Sforza connection opened a door not only to new possibilities, but also to fresh debates, where every detail, from the technique to the symbolism, would be dissected in search of certainty, even as doubt continued to linger. And before we move forward, leave a comment with the phrase "every trace tells a story," because these words capture the heart of this mystery, showing us how even the smallest marks on a page can echo through centuries, carrying fragments of truth that reshape the way we see the past. The discovery of the missing page in the Sforza manuscript seemed like the kind of revelation capable of settling centuries of speculation. The alignment of the holes was so precise, so deliberate, that it felt as though the portrait had finally found its rightful place in history. The idea that La Bella Principessa had once been bound within the pages of a book celebrating one of Milan's most powerful families created a sense of continuity, tying the drawing not only to an artistic style, but to the very fabric of Renaissance society. It was a hidden truth resurfacing, a behind-the-scenes detail capable of transforming the narrative entirely. And yet, as always happens with stories that brush against greatness, certainty slipped away, just as quickly as it appeared. For every expert convinced by the context, another pointed to what was missing. Leonardo's works are often recognized by his mastery of sfumato, that delicate technique of blending tones until transitions appear seamless, like mist fading into air. Critics argued that the profile in vellum lacked this softness, that its lines were too clear, too defined, and therefore out of step with the genius who painted the Mona Lisa. What some saw as a sign of experimentation, others interpreted as proof of inauthenticity. Once again, the portrait became a battlefield between possibility and doubt. The debate reached a symbolic climax when the National Gallery in London prepared an exhibition of Leonardo's works, created during his years in Milan. It was an opportunity to place the portrait alongside universally accepted masterpieces, a chance to let the comparisons speak louder than words. But the curators made a decisive choice. La Bella Principessa would not be included. That absence was more than curatorial. It was a statement, a reflection of the reluctance to fully embrace a piece still wrapped in uncertainty. The exclusion reminded everyone that the art world is not only about evidence, but about decisions, authority, and the mindset of those who hold power over cultural narratives. And here lies one of the most striking aspects of this journey. Truth in art is not always determined by what is visible, but by the balance of belief and skepticism, by the stories we choose to elevate and the ones we leave in silence. The portrait continued to live in the space between recognition and rejection, a fragile symbol of how history is shaped not only by facts, but by interpretations. It shows us the impact of perspective, how the same lines of chalk can be seen as either a revelation or a forgery depending on the lens through which they are examined. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because while the debates about authorship raged on, the story of lost works attributed to Leonardo did not stop there. Other discoveries, resurfaced paintings, and rediscovered treasures would continue to feed the mystery of how much of his genius still lies hidden, waiting for the right moment to return. And before we move forward, write in the comments, "I believe mysteries endure," because those words capture the essence of this saga, that even with evidence, context, and science, some questions are destined to remain open, drawing us deeper into the journey of discovery. The portrait, whether or not it truly left Leonardo's hand, became something greater than a debate over authenticity. It evolved into an emblem of mystery, a lasting enigma that mirrors the legend of Leonardo himself. His name has always carried with it a sense of unfinished stories, fragments of brilliance that survive while so much remains hidden behind the veil of time. La Bella Principessa fit perfectly into this pattern, embodying the tension between what we know and what we suspect, a reminder that genius often leaves traces too elusive to pin down. This sense of unresolved wonder found a parallel in another revelation that shook the art world. In 2005, Salvator Mundi, a painting long thought lost, resurfaced. It depicted Christ blessing the world with one hand while holding a crystal orb in the other. Its journey was one of rediscovery, restoration, and fierce debate, until it was sold at Christie's in New York for an astonishing $450 million. That sale transformed it into the most expensive painting ever purchased, proof of how the hidden truth of a lost work can change not only markets, but the way we see cultural history itself. The impact was immense. Once again, a work tied to Leonardo reappeared from obscurity, fueling the idea that somewhere, scattered across private collections and forgotten archives, more fragments of his genius might still be waiting. What makes this even more compelling are the historical traces that confirm the existence of paintings we no longer possess. In the notebooks of his pupils, we find descriptions of works that once hung in royal collections. In inventories of kings and noble families, there are mentions of Leonardo's pieces catalogued with reverence, only to vanish later into the uncertainty of wars, inheritance, or neglect. These scattered references act like faint whispers from the past, telling us that the masterpieces we admire today are only part of a much larger journey. Leonardo's art was not confined to the few canvases we can still see. It was a living body of work, some of it lost, some of it destroyed, and perhaps some of it still waiting in silence to be uncovered. This is what keeps the fascination alive. The knowledge that what we have is incomplete, that every rediscovery has the power to transform our perception, not only of Leonardo's legacy, but of art itself. It is a story of absence as much as presence, a narrative shaped by missing pieces that force us to imagine what once was. And in that absence lies a hidden truth. Sometimes what we cannot see exerts just as much influence as what survives. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because among those lost works, few hold as much allure as one particular painting, a masterpiece spoken of in records, sketched in notebooks, and whispered about across centuries, a painting that has become the ultimate symbol of desire and mystery in the art world, the one known as Leda and the Swan. And before we move forward, write in the comments, "The lost shapes the legend," because those words capture the essence of Leonardo's story, the understanding that his myth endures not only through the works we can touch, but through the masterpieces we can only imagine. Among all the whispers of Leonardo's missing works, few have carried as much fascination as Leda and the Swan. The myth itself already pulses with symbolism. Zeus, transformed into a swan, seduces Leda, and from their union are born children who would shape the destiny of ancient legends, including Helen of Troy. For Renaissance artists, this myth was more than a story of passion. It was a canvas for exploring beauty, fertility, power, and transformation. Leonardo, with his relentless curiosity for both the human body and the mysteries of nature, could hardly have resisted its allure. Records tell us that he did indeed paint Leda and the Swan, and sketches in his notebooks suggest how he envisioned her form. Elegant, elongated, almost otherworldly, her body twisting in a spiral that mirrored the harmony of natural design. But the painting itself, the original masterpiece, has vanished. What survives are copies, some made by his pupils, others perhaps by opportunistic hands trying to preserve, or even exploit, the power of the composition. These echoes remind us of what once existed, but they also create a kind of ghost image, a shadow of something we can never fully see. And that is precisely what fuels the intrigue. When art disappears, it doesn't fade from memory. It grows in mystery. The absence of the original Leda has made it even more legendary, a hidden truth that lingers behind the scenes of history, pulling us toward questions without answers. Was it destroyed, hidden, or quietly forgotten in some collection? Each possibility carries its own impact, each theory its own weight. And here lies the paradox. Leonardo's genius is reinforced not only by the works we can admire in museums, but also by those we cannot find. The lost paintings, the incomplete projects, the manuscripts scattered across centuries. Together they shape a narrative where the unknown is just as powerful as the known. His legacy is built as much on what survives as on what has vanished, a duality that keeps him endlessly relevant. Every rediscovery, every rumor of a hidden drawing or a misplaced canvas, reignites that fascination, reminding us that Leonardo was not only an artist of his time, but an architect of mystery. This is why each debate, each rediscovery carries such intensity. It is not only about authentication or monetary value, it is about reconnecting with fragments of brilliance that prove how far ahead of his time Leonardo truly was. His works are not static relics. They are living testimonies of curiosity, transformation, and vision. Even when pieces are missing, his presence endures, almost as if he designed it that way, leaving behind puzzles that future generations would struggle to solve. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic because the question that lingers is not just about lost works, but about the man himself. Behind every sketch and painting lies a restless spirit, a mindset that defied boundaries, and a journey that turned doubt into revelation. To understand why Leonardo continues to fascinate us, we need to step into that larger story, where art, science, and imagination become inseparable. And before we move forward, write in the comments, "Mystery keeps genius alive," because those words capture the essence of Leonardo's legacy, that what is missing is often just as powerful as what remains, and it is in that tension that his brilliance continues to shine. If you've made it all the way here, it probably means this story spoke to you in some way. That's exactly why I'd love to keep sharing more journeys like this with you. So make sure you're subscribed, because every new piece we uncover adds another layer to the bigger picture. And since you stayed with me until the end, drop a comment with the phrase, "I'm with you until the end." It's a simple way for me to know you're part of this path of discovery. If this video connected with you, leave a like. It helps me see that these explorations are resonating, and it keeps this space alive with curiosity. And before you go, there's a video right here that complements everything we've talked about today. Click and continue with me over there. The story only gets richer.